Okay. All right, so let me begin by introducing you to this new author that you will have the pleasure of reading. Hopefully you've already started. He's somewhat difficult. He's actually one of the most difficult philosophers that I have ever encountered. In fact, if you can master Levinas, you can master anybody. So you can be proud of yourselves by the time you're done with these couple weeks with Levinas, that you are able to master pretty much anything after him. Okay, so the outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to start with, so first of all, Levinas, this is, let's see, oops. Levinas, this is 1906. I think it's 1996, somewhere around there. I haven't exactly checked. I should probably check. Number one, we'll talk about post-Holocaust philosophy. Number two, we'll talk about his internment as a, biography and internment as a prisoner of war. And then we will look at his thought with a focus on the article we're going to read, which is Enigma and Phenomenon. Enigma and Phenomenon. And I will look at the problem of the hidden God. And second, I will look at ethics as an approach to God. Okay, any questions on the outline for today? All right, if any of you has spare time, you can look up the date of death of Levinas and confirm that I put the right date. So if any of you wants to mess around a little bit, just confirm in the chat whether I was right or wrong with 1996. It's either 1996 or 1993, I'm not sure. All right. Thank you, 1995. Okay, totally. Thank you, Park. All right, I'm changing. Thank you. Okay, I'm putting it in my notes. 1906 to 1990. I don't know why it was 1996 in my mind. All right, thank you very much, all of you, for confirming this for me. All right, so let's begin with the epoch, which is what I have called in the notes the post-Holocaust. We are in the context of post-Holocaust thinking, post-Holocaust philosophy, and post-Holocaust philosophy of religion. So we need to talk a little bit about this event, which has profoundly stirred the way that people do philosophy and the way that they think about God and about religion. And of course, Levinas is part of this movement. So in order to understand Levinas, we really need to understand number one, the Holocaust, and number two, the profound traumatic effect it had on the European psyche and on philosophy as a whole, right? So all of you know what happened, right? You've learned this in history. The Holocaust is the genocide of 6 million people during the Second World War at the hands of the Nazis. They were not only Jews, mostly Jews, but also Christians who supported those Jews. You had gypsies there, you had homosexuals, you had anybody who didn't fit into the, the ideal mold of the human being according to the Nazi ideology would be eventually sent there, right? And the Jews were the first ones to go. So this event profoundly shook the foundations of Judaism, first of all, right? Judaism took a huge blow. And we don't feel it so much here in the United States, but in Europe, it's still, the trauma is still there, and we'll talk about that trauma. But the main blow had to do with the concept of God, right? The main blow that the Holocaust performed was a blow to the concept of God. So let's talk a little bit about that, right? In other words, the concept of God was shattered at the Holocaust. So if we go to the traditional definition of God, we have the classic definition of God, right, as being both omnipotent, right? All power, let me just not write in Latin. All powerful and all good, right? This is classic definition of God. God is both, to be God, right? You have to be both all powerful and all good, right? You can't be one without the other. You're not God otherwise. otherwise, right? If you're all good, so that one is there too, but it's not as relevant for the topic, for what happened during the Holocaust. But yeah, you had omniscience also, the fact that he knows everything, right? But so you had all these concepts, but definitely you can't have anyone without the other, right? So, but the Holocaust really shook the foundations of these two concepts, the omnipotence and the all-goodness, right? The all-powerful character of God and the all-good character of God. So you can't have God if you just have one of these, right? If you're all-powerful but evil, that's not God, unless you're studying the book of Job, of course. Then you can have an idea of, oh my gosh, he looks to be, the God of Job does look to be both evil and all powerful, but let's put that aside. You can't have all good without all powerful, right? You need the power for it to be divine, right? So these two concepts are necessary to be thought together if you're going to be having a proper vision or a proper concept of God. Now, the problem with the Holocaust is that it turns out that God could not have been both of these and still allowed the Holocaust to happen, right? So, for example, if God is all good and all powerful, right? He can't be both. Either he is all good and he was powerless to stop what happened, right? Or he is powerful, but not as good as we thought, right? He at least doesn't fit within our understanding of what good means, right? So do you see how, in a way, these two concepts cannot be brought together anymore after the Holocaust? Does that make sense, right? Either he is all powerful and therefore not so good, because if he was all powerful, he could have stopped it, but he didn't. Why? Because perhaps he doesn't fit within our concept of good. Or he's all good, but clearly, how can you be good and not stop this? Clearly then not all powerful, right? So the definition of God, the concept of God took a hit, right? And so you're dealing in a way with the conceptual death of God, right? In other words, our vision of God, our perspective on God, who we thought God was, is completely destroyed at the Holocaust, right? And so in many ways, right, when Nietzsche predicted the death of God, right, he wasn't so far from the truth, right? When he says God is dead, in many ways after the Holocaust, our understanding of God, the God that we knew, right, the God that we grew up hearing about, the God that we were taught by our forefathers, doesn't exist. It doesn't make sense, right? The God that is taught in the churches and in the synagogues is a God who intervenes, who saves, who redeems, right? Who liberates. Where was this God, right? So either there is no God, or God is not who we thought he was, right? This is where we are after the Holocaust. Let me say that again, right? Either there is no God, and this was a big mass delusion, and Nietzsche was right? Or there is a God, but he's not who we thought he was. He doesn't fit anymore within the perspective that we have been taught for centuries. We have been wrong about God, it seems, right? So that's the first thing, right, this is where we are at the moment of post-Holocaust thought, right? Okay, so, all right, now let me tell you a story to illustrate this, this death of God, right, that was told very poignantly in the famous novel, The Night by Elie Wiesel, right? If you haven't read it yet, you must. It's a classic, both of literature and philosophy and culture, right? This is written by Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, who lived a long time in New York City, actually. And he passed away a few years, I think, ago, but he survived Auschwitz, which was the worst of all the camps. And he spent 10 years drifting around in Europe, not speaking a word about the experience. And then he began to write and to write and to write. And he wrote stories, novels, autobiographical essays, and he all around the theme, right? There's the theme of the Holocaust is always kind of permeates, right, his works. But he wrote a short autobiographical essay, right, on his experience in Auschwitz, and this is called The Night. And in this essay, he describes a scene, right, which in a way will clarify what I've been saying so far. So in Auschwitz, there was a custom that every morning, whoever had you know, committed a crime or tried to escape or stolen something during the night would be executed in the morning. And everybody had to stand there and watch, right? This was a custom, and all the prisoners were gathered in a large crowd. And then there would be the gallows, right, where you hang people, and they would hang whoever had committed some type of crime or misdemeanor during the night. And that particular morning, on the gallows, you had two men and a child, right? Very young child, maybe around 12 or 11 years old, right? And so they hung them in front of everybody, but the problem was the child was too lightweight. His weight wasn't heavy enough to cause the strangulation. And so he was having trouble dying. He didn't die immediately. He was stuck between life and death for several minutes, and everybody had to watch this, right? Now, at that moment, Elie Wiesel hears a voice behind him. Somebody speaks, right, or mutters, and says, you know, where is God? Where is God? Where is God here? I don't see him anymore. And at that moment, Elie Wiesel senses the answer within himself, and he points to the child and he says, there, that child, between life and death, he is God, right? This is such a powerful revelation that he had, right? Which is, by the way, so similar, so uncannily close to the Christian perspective of God, right? As dying, right, as a dying figure. But here the meaning is, right, God today in the West is caught between life and death. This experience, this Holocaust, might destroy forever this God, or he might survive, but we don't know. God is caught between life and death. We don't know if we can come out of Auschwitz and find this God again, right? We don't know if we will not die with us here in the camp, and we come out and there is no God anymore, right? So this summarizes very poignantly Nietzschean prophecy, the climate of the day, right? The concept of God and even the existence of God is taking a hit. This is where we are with the Holocaust, right? Now, Levinas, well, we'll talk about his biography in a second, but he didn't himself go to camp, but his whole family, extended family, was massacred in the camps, right? So he's sole survivor. We'll see why in a second. But he will really, his whole work, right, will be an attempt to respond to this question. Where was God? And if he was around, who is he? Right? Make sure you write this down. And I'll put it in the chat, right? The two fundamental questions that Levinas is responding to is, where was God, right, during the Holocaust? And if he was really around, right, who is he? Right? We see either God is dead, doesn't exist, never existed, right? That's the first logical conclusion. Or he exists, there is a God, but he's not who we thought he was, and so who is he? Have we misunderstood, right? And so Levinas is really going to be responding to this in most of his works, to this question: who is God? Where was God? And if he was anywhere around us, who is he? How did we miss him, right? Where was he hiding, right? These are the questions that Levinas is going to address, right? All right, let's get into his biography. Any questions so far? Or comments? Okay. All right, so his biography. So we now have the correct dates, thanks to you. 1906 to 1995. So he was born in Lithuania, which used to be part of the Soviet Union. Lithuania. Actually, now I'm having doubts, but anyways, it's over there in those three countries that are to the left of Russia, right? And so he was born in Lithuania in a Jewish Orthodox family, so he grew up pretty religious, but the Jews over there were very well assimilated in the culture, right? They were not trying to isolate themselves. They had no qualms about entering societies, the Western, about assimilating elements of Western civilization. And so Levinas really grew up in a very cultured environment in terms of Western culture. He spoke German, he spoke French, he spoke Russian fluently. He had, you can sense in the way that he's writing that he has read all of the Russian masters from Tolstoy to Dostoevsky, right? He's very well educated. So they're assimilated Jews, right? They're religious, but at the same time, they are very much assimilated in the culture of the time. So Lithuania, in general, the Soviet Union, around that time, from the 19th century on, you had really a problem of anti-Semitism, right? You had a lot of violent actions performed against Jews under the influence of the Orthodox Church, right? And for example, every Passover, every Easter, right, when the Orthodox Church celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, there would be always punitive measures, part of the ceremony, right, where the peasants who were worshiping in the church would go afterwards to the Jewish villages and destroy everything, because why? They had killed the Christ, right? The Jews are the ones who crucified Jesus in their minds. And so there would be this kind of retaliation every Easter, right? It was planned. And yes, Rivera, things don't change. I'm still dealing with things like this nowadays, right? So anti-Semitism was becoming things were becoming too dangerous. So they moved to the Ukraine, which was a little more tolerant at the time. But a few years later, still the problems came back. Anti-Semitism started to foment there too. And so Levinas, as soon as he could, he was around 17, he moves to France, right? France is supposed to be a secular country. There is no influence so much of Christianity. And so anti-Semitism is not so much a problem, right? At least compared to Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Soviet Union or Russia, right? So he moves to France in 1923. So he's, let's see, 1906, 1923. That's 17 years old, right? Somebody confirmed this. I'm very bad with numbers, as you can see. I believe he's 17. If I'm wrong, let me know in the chat. Okay, so he moves to France and begins studying philosophy, right? So he's and he's, just a good student. He also goes a little while to Germany. This is in 1928. This is before everything happened, right? He goes to Freiburg and studies under the renowned masters Husserl and Heidegger, right? These are two philosophical luminaries at the time, right? Everyone is interested in Heidegger at the time, right? Sartre is going over there. Everyone is going over there to learn from this guy. Let me write them down, right? So Husserl and Heidegger, these are the two philosophic, the spell check, Husserl, right? And Heidegger. And yes, Wozniak, Heidegger is impenetrable being in time. Yes, absolutely. Heidegger is mostly impenetrable because if you don't know German, because in German, he makes up words and it works in German. The language is very fluid. In English, it just looks like words that don't exist, right? So he's actually, just a footnote on Heidegger, right? He's actually a poet, right? He's right in German, not in English or French, but in German, because German is such a malleable language, you can add words at the end of other words and it creates a new word and it makes sense, right? So he's doing a lot of that, but when you try to translate him, you don't have the words because he's inventing words, right? And so it's very difficult. In English, it's better. In French, it's a disaster. It's absolutely impossible to understand Heidegger in French. In English, it works a little better, right? It's difficult. So Levinas studies with him for a while in 1928 and then returns to France. And then he's not really anybody who is well known. He starts to teach in Jewish high schools, right? So he doesn't even go into the mainstream French high schools. He goes straight into the Jewish system of education. Just like here in Queens, right? You have a number of Jewish high schools around Queens College. He goes and teaches for one of those. So he's nobody really at that point, right? Now in 1939, of course, 1933, Hitler comes to power. 1939, the war breaks out with France. And of course, like I told you before, his extended family is still in the Ukraine, right? Everybody in the Ukraine, right? The cities are emptied of the huge Jewish population that used to be there. If you went to Ukraine in the early 20th century, the cities were Jewish, right? You go now to Ukraine, to Kiev, right? One of the capital cities, no Jews, nothing, nobody left. They have all been killed, right? So there was such a huge population of Jews in Eastern Europe and Russia, and they were really, everybody, right, were invaded by Germany first, and then all of the Jews were rallied and brought and killed, right? So his whole extended family is destroyed, right, in the Holocaust. He is enlisted to fight in the French army because he's of age, right? And he has a wife and a young daughter. And thankfully, they're protected by some nuns in a convent, and they survive the war in this way. Now, Levinas goes to fight against the Nazis in the French army, and with his luck, he's immediately captured, right? He hasn't fought a few months, he's already captured. And they send him into a prisoner of war camp. Now, this is a prisoner of war camp for Jewish French, right? And they're already separating them. They're already concocting how they're going to get rid of those people. But right now, under international law, because he's a prisoner of war, they cannot touch him. But they still have a separate camp for Jewish military officers, and he's in that camp. So they're all Jews, but they're wearing a French uniform, so they're still to a certain degree protected by the uniform, right? So he's there, and this is where really in that camp that his philosophical mindset is going to mature, and he's going to really become the Levinas that we know today, or at least in his works, right? Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about that experience. He has written about it in a very famous article called "In the Name of a Dog." In English, it means nothing. In French, just so you have some beginner French, nom d'un chien has a double meaning. Nom d'un chien means both name of a dog, right? Nom is name, chien is dog, but it also means damn it, right? So he's playing with that expression. When you say nom d'un chien, it's like, right? It's like, damn, right? That's what we say in France, right? One of the ways we say that. So he's playing on the double meaning of nom d'un chien, name of a dog, and damn, right? But so let me tell you a little bit. In this essay, it's actually an essay about a dog, so that's why it has this name. So he describes in this essay powerfully not only his experience, but the shift that the experience operated in him philosophically. So I'll tell you the story, and then we'll look into how it influenced his philosophy. So story goes like this. So here they are, a bunch of prisoners of war, Jewish. And as prisoners of war, they're supposed to work. They're supposed to build railroads. They're supposed to dig trenches, whatever. They're supposed to do work for the Nazi army, of course, which has occupied France at that time, right? So now what's interesting is that their prison or their war camp, right, is in France, right? But France is occupied by Germany. So they have set up these camps for prisoners in the French territory. So this is important. So they're in France, somewhere in the east of France. And every day, so they leave the camp and they go out into the French countryside or French towns, and they do this work for the army, for the Nazi army. Now, Levinas starts to notice something very odd as they're going through the French villages. They notice that as they're walking through, the villagers don't want to look at them, right? They go through the street and the villagers kind of, turn away just to not look, they don't want to be part of this. They don't want to see it. They don't want to know about it. And this is constant, happens over and over again in every village they go to. The villagers have the same reaction of, they don't want to see, they don't want to look, they don't want to know. And, the prisoners are starting to feel like this is their countrymen, like they're French like us, like what's happening? Why, right? Why are they ignoring us? Why they don't even look at us? Why they don't even recognize that we're there? Right? And they start to slowly, psychologically, this attitude of the French villagers is starting to take its toll, right? And they're starting to feel dehumanized by the experience, right? And to the point where they start to wonder, are we human? Do we exist? Do we matter? What's going on, right? And so this is the general mood every day of the prisoners as they see how they are received by the villagers. And one day, one of those days, particularly gloomy day where they had been ignored all day, they go into the camp, go back home, or to the camp in the evening, and somehow the camp door is not closed immediately after them. It's kind of open for a bit, and a stray dog wanders in, right? So stray dog wanders in, sees a bunch of people, and if we had been live, I would have asked you how many of you are dog lovers, but I imagine half of you at least. Okay, so yes, a few of you are chatting your answers, right? But you know that when a dog sees another human being is the best thing that happened to the dog for the whole day, right? Right. So the dog goes up to them and he's like leaping up and barking and wagging his tail, and he's so happy to see them. And at that moment, Levinas realizes that this dog is the only being left in France who recognizes their humanity. And this is very poignant moment, because human beings have forgotten that they're human, but this dog hasn't forgotten, right? And so Levinas famously, or the prisoners, called the dog the last, I'm writing it down for you, Kantian in Germany. So if you would understand this if you know who Immanuel Kant is, right? Referring to Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher of the 18th century, who wrote a lot on humanity, right? On how to respect, right? I don't need to type this up, but Immanuel Kant is the philosopher in Germany who wrote the most about the dignity of human beings, how to protect the dignity of human beings. No, that's Buber Cosmidis, the I and the U. But Buber is certainly influenced by Kant, and they're saying pretty much the same thing, right? But Kant, he wrote a whole section on respect, how to protect the sacred character of the human. So a German philosopher from the 18th century. So they called the dog, right? They called the dog the last Kantian of Germany, right? Cosmidis is swearing in French, nom d'un chien. Very good, Cosmidis, you're catching on. Okay, so now this experience, right, which seems kind of trivial and, you know, kind of fun, or, you know, to the degree that you can have fun in a work camp. But this really, really profoundly shifted Levinas. And this brings us now to the third section, I believe, which is his thought, right? Yes, his thought. So in essence, if you want to understand Levinas, I will tell you in a nutshell his thought in general, and then we'll go into the essay that we're going to read together. So the main thing that Levinas gathered from his experience as a war prisoner was the realization that Western worldview didn't have, how shall I put it, a safeguard to protect the other. In other words, Western civilization knew how to protect its own citizens, knows how to protect its nationals, knows how to protect people who have the French passport, right? People who are French, but it doesn't know, right? So Western civilization is conceived to protect its own, right? Every nation protects its citizens, every country protects its own, but there was no concept in the West of the other, and especially of the need to protect the other. So what Levinas is realizing is that this lack of awareness of the other is not just something that was happening then. If you look at the history of philosophy, Western philosophy, the other is absent. I can give you a short overview of it right now, and you will see. The other is absent. There's only two things that are present: the self, very, very important concept in Western thought, and number two, the nation, right? Or the social contract around the people who have adhered to the social contract. So you have two main thoughts when it comes to humanity, to the philosophy of the human in Western thought. You have the center on the self, which we'll talk about, and the center on the community, like-minded community. The other doesn't exist, right? Let me give you a quick overview. And Levinas, actually, his whole work will be there to not only criticize Western thought on this point, saying you have never really explored that concept. You are entirely focused on the ego, right? You are entirely, like he says in many of his texts, solipsistic, right? In other words, you're entirely focused on the ego. And so that's the first thing he does in most of his works. And the second thing that he does is to try to awaken us to this reality, to this dimension of the other. And he does this in a number of ways, right? Which we'll talk about in a second. So let me first quickly give you an overview of how Western thought has been completely oblivious to the concept of the other. I mean, if you look at European thought, right, before, not counting Greek thought as now it is part of Europe, but looking at Western European thoughts, right, the main founder is Descartes, right? I'm writing down, right? He's really the one who has founded, especially French thought, right? French, German, all these countries, right, that have succumbed to Nazism have their foundation, the philosophy of these countries have their foundations in Cartesian thought. Now, Descartes is well known for saying, well, let me ask you, I haven't heard you for a while. I've been talking by myself here for an hour. Anybody know what is Descartes' famous statement, philosophical statement? Let's see if you remember. Take a break from myself.
It was cogito ergo sum, which is I think, therefore I am, I think.
Very good, right? Excellent. Right, I think, therefore I am. Let me write it in the chat for those of you who I think, therefore I am. So let me just talk a little bit about that, right? Because you will see how for Descartes, everything centers on the self. There's no other. Descartes starts out by saying, well, I want to find the truth that cannot be contested, right? And but I'm not sure if anything that I see or touch or feel is actually real. I'm not sure. It could all be a dream. I could be dreaming this. I could be imagining this. This is the scenario that you find in The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, #1, right? Where you have tubes attached to your head and you're dreaming your whole existence. And Descartes is like, maybe this is all a big illusion because I have dreamt and thought it was real. I have imagined and thought it was real. And now this could be a dream, right? So he says, how can there must be one thing that I can be sure of, right? And he thinks a bit and he realizes, well, the thing I'm sure of is that I am thinking. I'm not sure if anything that I'm seeing is real, but certainly there is something that is doing the imagining or the thinking, the self. And therefore he says, my first certainty, the first thing I'm sure of is that I am thinking. Something is there doing this imagining or this deluding or thinking, and therefore that thing which is there exists. I think, therefore I exist. So the first certainty for Descartes is the self. And then from there on, he rebuilds everything else. He proves the existence of the world, he proves the existence of other human beings, he proves the existence of God, but the founding stone is the self. Everything follows that pattern after Descartes. Kant, Husserl, even Heidegger to a certain degree, the self is the center. Everything else derives from the self, right? So you already have in the West a very egocentric way of thinking, right? There's no sense of the other as awakening me or the other as having any contribution, right? The other is useless in the individuation of the self in the West, right? And this is a big problem. The other has no essential function in the building up of the human self in most Western philosophers' mindsets. And this is a whole other can of worms, a whole other problem, right? That the self can emerge fully blossomed without any reference to the other. So that's the first point, right? The way that Western thought has been egological, centered on the self. Second point is the theories of social contract, which is what determines how the other than the self is taken care of, right? Now, anybody know the theory of the social contract? What is the condition in having the protection of the state? What must you do? So theory of social contract is that we get together. Together we are stronger. We are, in as much as we're together, we are in this agreement, and we are therefore supposed to protect each other from outside evil forces, right? So what is the thing we have to do in order to gain that protection? Let's see what Sosa says. You must give us some of your own rights. Okay, yes, you give us some of your own rights, and especially you have to belong to that community in order to receive their protection, right? So in other words, if you're in danger, you receive protection only if you belong to a certain community, only if you're part of that community, right? So now what happens if you're not part of that community and danger strikes you? What happens to you? Do you get any protection? Exactly, right? Rivera says you're alone. You have no protection unless you belong to a given community. In other words, you could have the following scenario, which happened during the Nazi era. You could have a whole community sticking up for its own, protecting its own. But if you happen to not be part of that community, right, nobody's going to help you because you're not part of the social contract. You're not one of us, right? In other words, there's this mindset in the West that only if you're one of us do you deserve my concern or my protection. If you're not one of us, you're not my concern. That's the idea that social contract theory has taught us, right? If you're not one of us, if you're not part of the contract, I have no responsibility towards you, right? And so, yes, it's what Rivera said. This is why American isolationism is so dangerous, right? Why? Why is it dangerous? I'm curious. Develop a bit your idea, Tyler. Tyler, you have to talk.
If we just depend on ourselves for everything and just ignore everyone, we're going to come to the point where we can no longer be self-sufficient, and we are going to be put like in a rock and a hard place.
Okay, yes, absolutely. We have left the community, the social contract of nations, right? If you look at the social contract that we have among the League of Nations, we are leaving it, and yes, a bit dangerous. You're right. Yes, that makes sense, right? So now what Levinas is noticing is that this social contract ideology is not enough when it comes to the kind of problems that occur during Nazi era, right? Yes, let me just interrupt because this is a good quote by Wozniak, right? First they came for the socialists. I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I did not speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. I said nothing because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me, right? Quote by Martin Niemöller, exactly, right? Wasn't that very good? Right. So in other words, given this idea that we only protect our own, right? It was very easy for the Nazi strategy to do the following. Let's make sure we disenfranchise the Jews. If we do, if we abstract them from the social contract to which they belong, if we say they're not really one of us, they're not really German, they're not really French, right? If we can convince people that the Jewish population is not a member of the country, of the nation, if we can convince them there's something else altogether, then it is very easy to destroy them. And that was exactly what Nazi propaganda did. The first step, before they could do this, right? How do you do this? How do you kill a huge amount of your neighbors? And nobody says anything. Well, the technique is very simple. Make sure your neighbors, the neighbors, don't believe that these people are their concern. And the way you do that is you disenfranchise them. Let me write down this word. I can't write. Disenfranchise them, right? In other words, you make sure that they are not seen as part of the community. And so before they could do anything to the Jews, they had to create this mass propaganda that the Jews were not really German. In fact, the Jews were not really human, right? They were kind of closer to the vermin, to the pestilence or plague than to human beings. So they had to develop this mindset in the people that the Jews were not one of them. Once you have taken them out of the social contract or broken the ties that bound them to the other people in the social contract by making them look like inhuman, then it's easy to kill them because people are so used to thinking we only protect people who are in the contract that when you have somebody else who's not in the contract and they get massacred, you're like, well, that's not my problem. He's not one of me. He's not one of us. Why should we care, right? Now, so that was the technique, right? Yes, the propaganda was everywhere, right? And Tyler is saying that even in the board games, there was this, and they had to do months of this before the people could become desensitized as to the fact that the Jew was a human being like them, right? Now, this technique happened elsewhere. You had the same propaganda in Rwanda. I don't know if you remember the genocide, right? In the 90s. I'm not even gonna say a number because it seems today that I'm very unlucky with numbers. So in the 90s, I think 94, 93, 94, y'all can check, y'all can fact check me again, right? But I think in the early 90s, right, you had, if you recall, some of you were not born, but that's okay. There was a genocide between two ethnicities in Rwanda, between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And the same technique was applied, right? The Hutus were the ones who wanted to get rid of the Tutsis for political reasons, which I won't get into. But in essence, the Tutsis were in control and they were the minority. And the Hutus were always considered second-class citizens and they were sick of it. And they decided to get rid of the Tutsis in a very radical way, right? But first, they had to make sure that they were not human. And so again, propaganda. And here the name that they gave the Tutsis were that they're not human, they are cockroaches, right? This was the code name for the Tutsis. And the more you repeat it, the more you start to see these guys as, yeah, they kind of look like cockroaches. Yeah, they're kind of gangly. And yeah. So you start to imagine them like that. And then when the day comes to kill them, it's easy because they're not one of us, right? Now I'm going to go close to home. I have to. We do this here too. There's been a whole propaganda against immigration. Now, whatever you think about immigration is fine, but the demonization of the immigrant is what bothers me, right? When we have statements that Mexicans are murderers and rapists, some of them being good people, some, right? This is a problem, right? Because we have, again, the same action. They are not like us. They are lower. They are rapists. They are murderers. They belong to evil, right? Now, it sounds inoffensive. It sounds ridiculous when you hear it. But if you repeat it over and over again, you're setting the stage for violence, right? Because once you become used to hearing that immigrants are, you know, invaders or problem makers or gangs or drug dealers, when the time comes, right? If the time comes, I'm not gonna say when, if, hopefully it's just if, right? It's easy, right? Because they're not one of us, they're lower, they're decrepit, they're, you know. And so this is the danger of words, right? This is why we need to be so careful of the words, especially that political leaders use to describe a given population, because history has shown that when we begin to demonize a segment of the population, it's not just words, it always leads to action, right? So this was just my little preachy moment on this topic. So anyways, back to Levinas. So Levinas is really both criticizing the West for its lack of concept of the other and also trying to awaken us to the dimension of the other, right? So now the text we're going to study by Levinas is going to be more focused on his philosophy of religion, but you will see that the other is also present there. Okay. Oh, by the way, going back to the Second World War, just to finish off, right? It was people like Levinas who brought about this awakening, this consciousness awakening of the need to protect the stranger and the other, right? After the war ended, right, people started to reflect on what went wrong, how could this happen, right, in civilized nations. And one of the things they realized is that not only citizens need to be protected, there must not only be a law for citizens, there has to be a law for non-citizens, for human beings, right? And this is what gave rise, of course, to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? I'm going to write this down for you, right? Universal Declaration, right? Of which you hear about occasionally, right? When you talk about, when you hear news from the United Nations. But this is a declaration which made sure we would never forget that not only citizens have rights, but every human being has rights, right? And this is a big debate even in the States, right? Who has rights? Who has rights to education, to healthcare, right? Who has rights? Universal Declaration of Human Rights says, well, not only the one who pays taxes, right? Basic human rights are for everybody, whether you belong to the nation or not. This was the contribution of, or this was the awakening that took place in Europe at the time, this awakening to the fact that we need to protect not only our own, but the stranger, if they become such, right? If a human being becomes disenfranchised to the point that they're no one, they still need protection, right? So this is, okay. Now, let's go to the text, Enigma and Phenomenon. Any questions so far or comments before we go on to the text we're gonna read together? Okay, all right, you're very quiet today. It's my fault. I'm talking a lot. All right, enigma and phenomenon. I'm going to look at these two issues. So right now I'm going to summarize, in essence, what the text says, so that when you enter the text, which is one of the hardest things you'll ever read in your life, you can kind of have some, how should I call it? Can't find the word in English. You have a roadmap. You have a kind of roadmap to be able to navigate the text a little bit, right? So a guide, yes, thank you, Chase. Right. Okay, so first of all, the problem of the hidden God. Okay, that's the first issue that Levinas is going to address in that very difficult passage. And in essence, he's going to start out subtly, you won't see it right away. He's going to start out with this notion of who is God after the Holocaust, right? We don't understand who he is, we don't recognize him, and this is important, we are starting to doubt not only him, but to doubt that he even exists, right? So he starts out with this generalized feeling or generalized unease felt by his contemporaries, especially if they have a religious background and now they're coming out of this experience, the experience of doubt, right? Levinas starts there with where people are at his time, right? The questions cannot be ignored anymore. And the distrust is growing. The distrust in God, the distrust in the religious institutions which taught us about this God. This is where we are. Doubt, distrust, disappointment, cynicism, right? And so this is all these emotions, right? Doubt, distrust, cynicism are symptoms of what Martin Buber would call the eclipse of God, right? Martin Buber is another philosopher around the time of Levinas. He has written a book actually called The Eclipse of God. And these are symptoms, right? God has hidden his face. We do not see him clearly anymore. We are doubting that he even exists. And if he does exist, we can't see anymore who he is, right? So these feelings of distrust, cynicism, rage, disappointment, doubt are all stemming from this experience of the eclipse of God. And this is where Levinas starts. Now, what he's going to do, which is brilliant, is that he's going to take the doubt and reframe it as a spiritual experience. And this is what we're going to discover together next time, right? So in other words, he's not going to make doubt a path away from God. He's going to show us that doubt actually is one of the paths to God, right? And so he's doing something extremely beautiful, right? He's taking a negative experience, an experience of the absence of God, and he's transforming it into a positive experience of the awareness of God. So we have to see how he does this. I'm not going to tell you yet, but all we know is that he's going to transform this experience into a religious experience, right? In other words, and we'll see how, right? I'm not going to tell you everything, but he's going to transform the experience of doubt, and he's going to not transform it, but he's going to reinterpret it, right? Shed a new light on it, illuminate it from a different perspective. And we are going to see, in a way very similar, actually, you should begin to see connections with Maimonides, whom we studied, right? Maimonides has a similar approach to doubt and questions, if you recall, right? Let's remember a little bit. What did Maimonides say about the questions? I know it was very long ago. It was before the pandemic, pre-corona text that we studied, right? What was Maimonides' attitude towards the people in his congregation who had doubts about God, about revelation? Okay, very good, Arna, right? It was good to question. Anybody remember why it was good to question? Why? How do we move closer with our doubts, Cosmidis? Seems like it's taking us away.
I feel like I don't remember exactly. I'm gonna be honest, but isn't it something about how, like, if you don't question, it's bad, because then you're just like blindly accepting things, and that actually keeps you like further from God, because your acceptance is blind. So when you question and you doubt, it's just your mind trying to push you to like I don't know. I don't remember exactly when you question what happens, but I know that when you don't question, it like keeps you blocked off from God. I know that questioning would open you up.
Very good. How does the lack of questioning keep us locked off from the true God? In other words, he who does not question, does he know God or does he know something else? See if you remember.
He knows like what the books and what the people have told him to believe, not like the real God.
Exactly. He knows a constructed God. And what's the name for this constructed God? Very good. Somebody says it in the chat. Idolatry, right? Rivera, very good, right? If you don't question, you remain stuck with a very narrow perspective, the one that was taught to you, which is in a way an idol. It's a small view of God taught to you by your tradition, right? The questions are there to broaden your view. And therefore you have an a more refined awareness of who God is. If you have a small view, remember, you don't see much. You see small God, idol. If you question, you broaden your mind. When you broaden your mind, you see more. And in that sense, for Maimonides, you come closer to God than the one who doesn't question, because the one who doesn't question has a small mind, and therefore a narrow perspective of God. The more you question, the larger your mind, therefore the broader your perspective, right? Yes. The more you question, the bigger your vessel. Very good, Arnaud, right? So Levinas is not going to exactly say that, but he's going to be like Maimonides, very sympathetic to the ones who doubt. And we're going to see how he frames it. And again, we will see that doubting for Levinas is the royal road to God, actually. Not just, I said earlier, one of the paths to God is the royal path, right? And we'll see that he connects in many ways to Maimonides in his argument. So review Maimonides so you can understand what Levinas is saying here. So the second point we're going to look at is the ethics as a mode of approach to God. And this is really, this is Levinas's brand, this notion of ethics as the path to God, right? And this, we're going to see how for Levinas, we need to move away from a spirituality which is vertical to a horizontal spirituality. So I'm going to explain, vertical to horizontal. Right? In other words, this notion that there's a God in heaven that we should pray to and worship and he will come and help me. This is finished, right? This doesn't exist. After the Holocaust, it's childish to believe that, you know, you and God is there, somewhere up there, and you can pray and somehow he will come down and help you. This after the Holocaust is over, right? And so what Levinas is going to say, if this view of God is over, doesn't mean that God is obliterated, that God doesn't exist anymore. And what Levinas is going to do, which is masterful, is find God again, but this time on the horizontal level, on the interhuman level. In the interactions between humans is the new place of worship, the new place of truth, the new place of revelation, right? So Levinas has to make this shift in order to make sense of a God, you know, make sense of the coexistence between God and the Holocaust, right? So just make sure you write this down, and then of course we'll go into details. With Levinas, this notion of a God who saves you, comforts you, protects you, this is over, right? We can't think about this anymore unless we are naive, according to him, or delusional. And Nietzsche, by the way, who is still with us, right? He hasn't left the classroom, would applaud Levinas on this point, right? He's like, damn right, right? Yes, this notion of a God who helps, this is a big delusion. I'm so glad he would, well, he wouldn't say that hopefully, but certainly the Holocaust has taught us that this God is not, doesn't exist. There is no evidence of this God coming down and helping and protecting, right, in this moments. So what Levinas is going to do is going to say, yes, this kind of God is dead, but I can still find God, but I have to shift. I have to shift my gaze from the vertical to the horizontal. So we're going to see how that works. How is it, who is this God that Levinas is going to find now on the horizontal level? And we're going to see, and this is very important, what this is going to entail is a redefinition of who God is. And this is going to be a tough one for some of us, right? The way that Levinas will redefine God is going to go against everything that we have been taught. We're going to move from a strong, all-powerful God to a weak, vulnerable God, right? This is so out there, right? But this is what needs to happen. if we're going to be able to think together the event of the Holocaust with a divine presence in the world, right? We have to redefine who God is. We have to move beyond our idols, right? The idols have been destroyed. This notion of a big God on a throne, you know, looking down and helping, this was an idol because it was shattered, right? And so now we have to have a different perspective if we're going to move forward. And Levinas is proposing such a different perspective, but it's going to be counterintuitive, go against everything that we have been taught, to move from a strong, all-powerful God to a God who is weak and vulnerable sounds almost Christian. I mean, Levinas is turning over in his grave right now as I'm saying this, but it's very close, right, to this notion of the suffering God that we have in Christianity, right? But of course, Levinas is not going to go there, right? He's going to situate God and describe him differently, but we are going to have to shift our perspective on God. We have to shatter the idols that we have had so far. The concepts that we have had are too narrow to be able to survive the Holocaust. We have to shatter them and move towards a different approach, and that's what Levinas is going to do, right? So you have to be prepared for a different way, a different path to God, which Levinas will call the path of humanity, and we have to be prepared for a different vision of God, one that goes against everything that we have been taught, right? Okay, I'm leaving you in suspense on purpose. I'm not going into the details because I want to keep that for, I want you to discover a little bit in the text by yourselves. Okay, any questions on anything I said before I go into how to read Levinas?
Could you just repeat that last thing? You said the path of humanity, which is a different path to God, and then you said there was another one after that.
And it's the same, and we have to redefine our concept of God, right? So the path to God is different. It's not the path of prayer, ritual is the path of relationship with human beings. That's the first thing. And then God is different. It's not the omnipotent God, you know, Santa sitting on his throne. It's something else, right? So we're going to discover this new vision of God together as we study Levinas in the next few weeks. Any other questions? Why can't I see you when you talk? It's annoying. And the gallery speaker view, I must have pinned myself without knowing. How do I unpin myself? Oh, well. Any other questions before I go into how to read Levinas? So I prepare you to, for what you're about, for the trauma you're about to experience.
I have a question. What kind of text is this? Is it secular? It's not atheist, obviously.
Yeah, it's secular. I mean, Levinas is writing for a secular audience, right? And this particular text, right, is entirely philosophical, secular. I mean, he's talking about God, but as a philosopher, right? So yes, you could say it's secular text, absolutely, because this is an experience in a way which takes place outside of the structures of religion, right? What he's going to describe, and which is accessible to all of us, even if you're an atheist. We saw this a little bit with Marcel, right? You saw how with Marcel, what he's describing is an experience of transcendence, which is not religious, right? The connection to being is something that we can all have, that we all experience through love, hope, fidelity, right? We all experience this, whether we are atheist or Christian or Buddhist, right? And he doesn't call it God. It's an experience of the absolute. It's an experience of transcendence, which he describes philosophically. Levinas is doing a similar style, right? He calls it God, but actually doesn't, because ultimately the name he's going to use to describe this dimension of the divine is the word enigma, right? Maybe I can talk about that really quick, right? Enigma versus phenomenon, because I might forget to do so. What's an enigma? What does enigma mean? Nobody knows? Something unexplainable. Yes, Tyler, very good. Enigma is something you can't explain, something mysterious, something you don't have a grasp on. This is how Levinas describes the dimension of the divine. Just like Marcel, right? Marcel uses the word mystery, remember, to describe this dimension that is spiritual but not religious, right, is transcendent but not institutional. Levinas, instead of the word mystery that Marcel uses, is going to use the word enigma, which means the same. So they're similar, they're very close, right? I wonder sometimes if they knew each other. They were in the same city. I really can't understand why their paths didn't cross, right? So same thing, right? Levinas is going to talk about the dimension of the enigma. He doesn't call it God on purpose, because God is another narrow way of, right, defining what this dimension is giving too many attributes, God, right? So he wants to maintain the mystery. So he calls it enigma versus the phenomenon. Anybody know what a phenomenon is? Let's see, Cosmidis, you're Greek. Phenomenon is a Greek word. Let's see if you can.
I'm not.
I always put you on the
It's escaping me. I can't think of it on the spot at the moment.
Phenomenon is almost Rivera. It's something that appears. A phenomenon is an appearance, something that is visible. That
Yeah.
Oh, you got it. Okay.
Phenomenon. I'm showing, yes.
It's not unexplainable. Morales, unexplainable, that's enigma. I know that we use phenomenon in that way to say that it's an unexplained occurrence in like ordinary language, but actually the actual Greek meaning of phenomenon is that it's simply something that happened. It's something visible, manifest, there, present, and so forth. Yeah, ordinary language, yes. It's how we philosophers talk about how y'all are talking. Ordinary. we're the elites talking about you guys as ordinary folk, right? So okay, so phenomenon is something, or vernacular, yes, that would be better. So a phenomenon is something that is visible, that you can see clearly, that you can understand clearly. And Levinas is going to contrast the two dimensions, and he's going to conclude by saying that the dimension of God belongs to the dimension of the enigma and not to the dimension of the phenomenon. It belongs to mystery and not to something that you can know, explain, control, use for your purposes, teach, impose, right, as religions have done, right? The problem with religion, according to Levinas, all religions, they have made God into a phenomenon. They have taught who God is, what God wants, who God loves, who God hates. How do they know, right? Who are you to know what God wants, who God loves, who God hates, who God is going to send to hell, who God is going to send to... This is all complete fabulation, right? According to philosophers like Levinas. And Nietzsche there is good friends with Levinas. They both would agree, right? So Levinas and Nietzsche would be sensitive to this. Says, we have to stop classifying God as a phenomenon, because this is doing violence to who God really is. We have to move God back into the dimension that he belongs to, which is the dimension of enigma, mystery. We have to continuously cultivate this sense that God is unexplainable, uncontrollable, unmanageable, mysterious. And we saw this where? First text we studied? Before I answer Rivera, anybody remember?
Job.
Yes. Right, Job, God, unmanageable, untamable, ungraspable, unpredictable, right? This is mystery, right? The book of Job already was developing these notions that Levinas is going to now develop for us further, right? Actually, let me respond to Rivera since I have like 5 minutes. This definition, that famous definition in the Hebrew Bible, right? When Moses asked God his name, and God answers in a very weird way, and he says, I am that I am. Okay, whoever is a Christian or a Jew, you can recognize this strange response, right? So this doesn't make anything, and it doesn't make any sense in either language, in either Hebrew or translations. Why? Because of mistranslation. I think we talked about this. I must have responded to, I don't have it, yes. Sorry, I'm going to respond to everyone. So the expression, I am that I am, right? This is God's response to Moses. When Moses is first called by God to deliver the people of Israel out of Egypt, he asked God, what is your name? And God says, I am that I am, right? So we have, kind of found this to be kind of strange, the reason it sounds so strange is that it's a mistranslation. I think I mentioned this text in my introduction to Maimonides. The actual Hebrew is I will be who I will be. That's what the actual Hebrew says, right? That's Hebrew conjugation, right? So what God is saying is that you don't know. I will be who I will be. You cannot pinpoint me here and say, God is this, God is that, because I will be who I will be. This is the perfect Hebraic, right, story from the Hebrew Bible, which correlates with what Levinas is trying to say when Levinas says God is enigma. We cannot know who he is, where he's going, what he's going to do next. We knew who he was, but who will he be now, right? In other words, for Levinas, we should always be ready for new revelations. Okay, we thought God was omnipotent, but now who is he, right? Where must we move now? What deeper revelation should we open ourselves to, right? If God is I will be who I will be, then we should be ready to continuously undo our idols and move towards broader, deeper revelations. That's what is meant, right? By this expression, I will be who I will be. And that's what Levinas is saying. Enigma. We don't know. We never knew, and we will not know, right? And we have to dwell in this mystery or enigma if we're going to ever come close to having a connection or an experience of God, right? Okay. Any questions? Any other questions before I talk about how to read Levinas? Okay. All right. So let me prepare you for reading Levinas. Let me tell you my experience with reading Levinas. So I read Levinas first time when I was your age. I think I was undergrad. I wanted to do a thesis, right? And I went to a professor and I said, I want to do something on existentialism and Jewish philosophy. Very vague. That's the perfect, horrible thesis idea. The professor was very understanding. He said, okay, why don't you read Levinas? I said, okay. So I got the big book, Totality and Infinity. It was like, I think it was Thanksgiving break. I went home, started reading. I read the whole book, came back. He's like, so, did you like it? I said, yeah, I loved it. I didn't understand a word, but I loved it, right? This is Levinas. You don't understand a word, but he's intoxicating, right? There is a rhythm. There is, let me give you an example. How many of you have read either The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald or The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie? Anybody? Nobody has read either?
I have.
Okay, one person. Cosmetis has
I've read Gatsby.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, it's required to. Okay, so you've all read Gatsby. Do you remember how when you're reading that book, you feel like you're like in a stream of consciousness? It's like you're just like, it's just like you're caught up in a stream and you're just going like this, and you kind of start to feel intoxicated, which is how all of the characters in the book are all day long, right? Do you feel what I'm saying? How the book feels like it's carrying you along. You're not in control. You're just going with the flow. It's like a stream of consciousness. This is Levinas, right? Levinas will. What's that? It will. Let's see.
Oh.
I like. Yeah, it will. Who said that? Who spoke? Can I say it again? It will pull you.
Yeah,
it will pull you in. I like what Tyler is saying. Mr. Hemingway says a lot of things I don't understand, Matilda said to her. And don't worry about the bits you can't understand. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music. That's it. Thank you, Tyler. That's exactly how you need to read Levinas. Okay? Please read what he wrote in the chat. Sit back and allow the words to wash around you like music. Levinas is a poet more than a philosopher. There is a rhythm. There is an aesthetic. It sounds like you're on a treasure hunt with Levinas. Every sentence you sense you're onto something, but you don't know what. That's the idea, right? My feeling when I read Levinas for the first time was that everything he was saying was a huge mystery that would resolve all the problems of life, but I didn't know what it was. you just get a sense of being on the threshold with something incredibly important and mysterious. That's where levinas takes you. It takes you to the threshold of something magnificent, but you can't completely grasp it. So I want you to experience this. Don't try, in other words, don't try to understand levinas. Just try to put yourself, to allow yourself to be carried to this threshold, to be carried to this limit, to this. It's like you're in front of a cliff and you see, but you can't get there, right? That's how levinas is, right? So allow yourself, transported, that's the word I was looking for. Allow yourself to be transported, right? By the style, by the rhythm, by the beauty of the language, right? Levinas is more felt than understood. In other words, you need to simply feel him. How do you feel as you're reading this? Don't try to understand, you're going to get frustrated, right? And angry, and you're going to cry, right? So don't do it, right? You want to just allow it to wash over you, and then do the reading assignment the best you can. I don't care how you do it, but just really allow Levinas to transport you to another dimension, right? He writes like this on purpose. And we'll talk about, maybe when we meet again, why he writes like this. We'll probably have more time to talk about that. But in general, you need to simply read and enjoy this sense of being at the edge of the world, right? You've reached the edge of the world, and yet there is more, but you can't get there. That's how you should read Levinas, like an explorer, right? Okay, any last questions? Okay, now, I'm going to ask whoever wasn't here right on time, please stay briefly behind so I can take attendance. If not, you can go. And whoever has questions, you can also stay behind.